Monday afternoon, and my esteemed colleague is here, John Atack. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Alex. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you for coming back onto my channel. I'm looking forward to speaking to you again. And we've lost you. Off to a flying start. I don't know if you guys can see me and hear me. Oh, you're back, John. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Thank you. Yeah.
Off to a flying start, eh?
Yeah. The obviously the body thetans have
Infested.
interfered with the stream. Yeah. when my kids were young, I used to be told off for talking about the power angers, and it's nice to see them coming back again. You know, the 20th century religion of Scientology, circa 1950,
and
leading edge.
I will never forget the way Oron Hubbard used to say ribbits rather than robots.
Yeah, he had some, and Renaissance instead of Renaissance. You know, there was so much of it. I mean, good grief, terrible.
Well, yeah. I thought it'd be interesting today to talk about government action. And when I was texting you about this, you said, and inaction. And I thought that was such a very valid point, because obviously I had a meeting with a member of parliament recently, and I've been really kind of pushing for a review on the law around coercive control. And the legislation that exists in the UK at the moment is specifically geared towards domestic partnerships, close family relationships. And I believe that there's scope for that to be expanded so that it applies to the relationship one has with a group, whether it be a religious minister, a pastor, or a cult like Scientology. So I've been really pushing for that and trying to build relationships with members of parliament. And I went to Westminster the other week to have a meeting. It was really, really productive. And it was, for me, it felt quite eye-opening to be in the seat of power, talking to somebody who has the ability to affect change, a member of parliament. Obviously, there are 650 MPs. So it's not like one MP is going to change anything, but just being in the place where change happens and speaking to someone about my experience and my concerns as an ex-Scientologist, and being able to be heard and listened to, I think was really impactful for me. And it appears we've lost John Atack again.
It appears John Atack has returned again.
Oh, there we go. Okay, I can't see you, but I can hear you. You're back now. Okay, cool. So yeah, it was just really impactful to be in the place where change happens. And I just wondered what the history was like around Scientology activists and former Scientologists being able to speak to members of parliament. I know that there was the Foster report in the 70s. There was the Leahy ruling in the 80s, which I'm sure we'll get into more later. But from your perspective, could you give me a bit of a rundown of what the past has been like from an activism point of view within the context of government?
Well, the first significant report is Victoria, one of the 6 states of Australia. And the Anderson report came out of that. That was an immense investigation. They spoke with hundreds of people and came to the conclusion quite accurately that Scientology is a form of hypnotism. It's a form of guided imagination. It's a way of getting people to interpret reality in a particular way. And they then made the stupid decision to ban Scientology, both there and I think in New South Wales. And 14 Scientologists were arrested and imprisoned for practicing Scientology. Scientology pretty quickly realized you just re-register, you become the Church of the New Faith, and then you can't be arrested. So, in fact, the last of the reports, which I have here, the Foster report, which was the UK government report in 1971, he condemns the Australian practice and says, you know, you shouldn't ban this thing. You should regulate psychotherapy. And so it's interesting, the British Parliament already in 1971 had this thing that there should be safeguarding and there should be regulation of psychotherapy. So there were inquiries in the Ontario Canadian inquiry, an inquiry in what is now Zimbabwe, the Rhodesia inquiry, and the South African inquiry. And really, I think the Foster report, the last of them, in the UK is the significant one, because this guy's very even-handed. He's Sir John Foster, KBE, QC, Queen's Counsel, MP. So he's a man with, he's a senior barrister, a lawyer, who's also a member of Parliament, who's also been knighted. And he prints a great deal of Hubbard material. I was just looking at How to Do a Noisy Investigation by Kathy Gogley. And he would just print the whole of a policy letter or such like and say, well, this is what they believe. And when you start getting to the harassment policies, the fact that they were out in the open from the 1960s, as soon as Hubbard issued, the idea of the suppressive person, fair game against people, of how to do a noisy investigation. So you phone people up and you say, I'm investigating the criminal activity of apostate Alex or whoever, and we've already got some astounding facts. Having had this done to me so many times over the years, you kind of get used to it, but it's still deeply unpleasant. They sent Eugene Ingram, who was the guy who'd been chucked out of the LAPD and worked as their lead harassment agent throughout the 80s and 90s. They sent him all around the world to trying to collect information about me. He went and found, my girlfriend from when I was 19. He went to Australia to interview her. I had somebody else ring up who I'd not heard from for more than 20 years. He rang up to apologize for the rumors that had been put around regarding her, which she'd had something to do with, and she wanted to withdraw and say it wasn't really so. So what Foster comes to at the end is he makes 2 points. One is that psychotherapy should be regulated, and to this day it isn't. You can, in the US, you have to have a master's degree before you can claim you're a counsellor, and there's some logic to that, though I'm fairly suspicious of some of the forms of counselling that are being used, but never mind. You have a proper qualification that's come from a university or an accredited society, and so you can't just have somebody who's read Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, and is now hypnotizing people. And L. Ron Hubbard did say in 1951 in Science of Survival, the method used in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, is a form of hypnotism. So there's an absolutely open admission on Hubbard's part that this technique, which is still being used, and he talks about the fluttering of the eyelids as the person enters reverie, which is a hypnotist term for light trance. There should be some regulation on people doing this if they are being paid any money for doing it. That would be my perspective, that if you want to go out and chat with people and do whatever for free, which wouldn't really suit, the Hubbardista, that they are, the governing policy of Scientology is to make money, make more money, make others produce so as to make even more money. So if you took that away, I think that is an important aspect of regulation. The other thing that Foster said is that he questioned charitable status, which of course Scientology doesn't have. Narconon does in the UK, or in England and Wales. Scientology doesn't. But he questions the very idea of charitable status for religions, which was a very interesting thought in 1971. Being able to say, why do our private schools have charitable status? Why do Christian groups who are recruiting have charitable status? And he felt that there should be restrictions there. The third point, which you started with, the coercive control extension to the Criminal Law Act in 2015, since that came in and before it came in, many of us have been saying, well, if this happens, if people can manipulate other people psychologically, and I question the use of coercive. I don't think anybody looked that up in the dictionary, because that means force, intimidation, or threat. And we're actually talking about manipulation that does not include force, intimidation, or threat. That's, as the law is phrased, you see that they don't mean the word they used for it. So if you can manipulate another person, then we should all be protected from that, not simply within intimate relationships. So I think what you're saying is the significant point, that we should look at changing the law so that when somebody's been enslaved, and that is the reality in Scientology, when somebody's worked a 90-hour week, been forced to have abortions, you've done menial tasks, been screamed and shouted at and bullied, they should have recourse to law. They should be able to get that to stop and to get compensation. So, you know, I think that's the vital place to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's definitely a couple of second delay between what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, by the way. So apologies to anyone that's that's annoyed by this, but just stick with us. I'm sure the body thetans will go away at some point. But we'll carry on. In terms of the legislation, like, there are so many different ways that we can go about this, and my engagement with politicians, I'm not in any way saying that this is the only way or it's the best way or there aren't other ways. It's just, this is where I've ended up. I don't have a master plan of like, okay, so this is what I'm going to do and it's going to take 5 years and then I'm going to do this. It's just, I'm very much stabbing in the dark based on the research and experience that I have done and what I feel is right. So there's not one right way of doing it. And so at the moment I'm focusing on this coercive control legislation, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't focus on things like John was talking about, the psychotherapy hypnosis angle, which is a whole different set of legislation and a whole different angle. And then there's the front groups like Criminon, Narcanon, and there's also fair game and harassment. So all of these things are ways of engaging politicians, and one isn't better than the other. This is just the one that I'm focusing on at the moment. And I wanted to bring up, this is the statutory framework guidance, which was published by the UK government with regard to the Serious Crime Act, which is what makes coercive control a criminal offence. And it mentions specifically the coercive control here. Let me just share my screen, because it mentions religious context, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Here we go. Here. Okay, so this is the framework guidelines, and it says abuse relating to faith. Whilst faith can be a source of support and comfort to victims, domestic abuse can occur in relation to and through using an individual's faith and belief system. Using religion and faith systems to control and subjugate a victim can be a form of emotional and psychological abuse. It is often characterized by a systematic pattern of controlling or coercive behavior within a religious context, and can be perpetrated by a current or former partner as well as family members. Yeah. Now, this is where I see the gap in the market, if you like, because it says it can only be perpetrated by a current or former partner or family member. And my point is that all of that can be perpetrated by, a pastor or a minister or, somebody within the group of which you are a part. And that's the exact change that I'm asking for, is for the law that already exists to apply so that in a different way, so that the government recognizes that it's not just a close family member that can abuse someone using faith.
Yeah, I mean, it's like taking the idea that, if somebody hits you, that's wrong if they're a family member, but it's okay if they're not. And it makes no sense. If these forms of abuse occur, then delineating them as familial, it's too narrow. And it was because of the kind of shift, which caused largely by Evan Stark, I think, into this notion of coercive control, that domestic abuse was not necessarily violent, and that we needed to understand that probably the most significant component was mind control, that the person was being reduced to civility, to slavery, to compliance through a set of methods and techniques which do not necessarily include any violence or any threat, any force of any kind, but gaslighting, bringing the person under control, so they will stop having relationships with people outside, so they will stop following their own objectives, and they will work against their own best interest, which I think is a vital aspect in all relationships, that if a relationship is making somebody sacrifice themselves to the benefit of another, then we need to be very careful about that relationship.
Yeah. And my question, I suppose, is why hasn't something been done already? Like, when you think about the Foster report in the 70s, it raises very valid concerns about the harassment, the fair game, the intimidation. It actually goes so far, if I remember correctly, as to say that, Scientology can be potentially damaging to people's mental health because it's practicing psychotherapy without any sort of regulation. And that's why there needs to be regulation in that industry in order to prevent people being harmed by things like Scientology. It says that in no uncertain terms. And
I'll give you the exact words if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
It's paragraph 249D. The possibilities of harm to the patient from the abuse or the unskilled use of these techniques are at least as great as the possibilities of good in the right hands. So you can do as much harm as you can do good by using these techniques. And
yeah. And then you fast forward to the 1986 or 1980, I think it was 86, was the Leahy ruling.
84.
84, thank you, where a High Court judge, Lord Justice Leahy, ruled that Scientology was socially obnoxious, it is dangerous, it's harmful, especially in relation to the young and the vulnerable who Scientology try and prey upon, so that they become the unquestioning victims and do what they're told, basically. So it's not like there hasn't been recognition by the government and by the legal system that Scientology is a harmful practice. But still, they haven't gone that one step further to actually introduce legislation in order to stop that from happening. And I wanted to know why you think that is.
Well, I worked on the Leahy case. It was the first case that I worked on. Along with, that's when I first met Jerry Armstrong, Hubbard's archivist, back in 1984. And it was a peculiar case because it was a family case, and family cases are heard in camera, that they're heard without the public present. But Justice Leahy, after what he'd heard, decided that he was going to go into open court and give a ruling. Now, it was later determined that this was improper. He should not have done it. Yeah. It's a violation of family law. So the ruling in and of itself has no value legally. It's important to say that. The reason it has no value is because of that technicality, that this man had heard so much evidence, and I was, helping get witnesses. I was bringing documents in to the case. We had a situation where, it's worth explaining probably. What had happened was that a couple split up, and the wife wasn't really interested in Scientology. And they met with the chaplain at St. Hill, who pointed out that as the husband was a good Scientologist and had paid lots of money and done lots of courses, that he should have the residence of their infant children. So the wife went away, having been browbeaten into this situation, and she remarried. And I think it was 2 years after this decision by the chaplain that she went to court and said, no, there's, just because he's further up the bridge than I am, that doesn't make him a good parent. And the husband had put a statement into court saying that he thoroughly disagreed with the practice of disconnection, the shunning or ostracism that is practiced by Scientology. I was able to bring a witness to court who was his business partner, who had been declared suppressive. And he had a letter from this guy saying, oh, we can still run a business together. We don't have to see each other. And he was talking about having a partition up the stairs so they would never have to see one another. So Mr. Justice Leahy saw this kind of hypocrisy and these attempts to get around the law, and gave a 54-page ruling, part of which you've read there. There have been many legal rulings, particularly, say, the Breckenridge decision in Armstrong in June 1984, where he said the organization is clearly both schizophrenic and paranoid, like its founder, L. Ron Hubbard, which I don't think he meant as a compliment. The one that's not really talked about and should be is the Casey Hill decision in Canada in 1993, where a judge in Canada had been harassed by Scientology and libeled by Scientology, so he sued them, and they kept on harassing him. And that judgment is incredible in showing the lengths to which Scientology will go to harass a perceived opponent. And this time there was a major judgment against them in consequence. But most of these actions are civil actions, they're not criminal actions. And one of the ways that Scientology has always got around this, and I've worked on more than 150 court cases over the years, and we won more than 90% of those cases, so we did fairly well. But you see the strategy they use, which is say, oh no, that's the Church of Scientology Religious Education College Incorporated. That's not Bridge Publications or the Religious Technology Center or any indeed of the 400 or 500 corporations which are theoretically separate. So one of the things that I did, it was in the 88, I put together the corporate structure of Scientology and showed that in fact every corporation was controlled by David Miscavige. I had affidavits from people who'd been directors of these corporations who said, well, he keeps an undated signed resignation from every director of every corporation. So as soon as anybody speaks out against him, so when Vicky Asnaran, who'd been the Inspector General of the Religious Technology Center, when she sued them, all he had to do was put the date on the resignation. And she was no longer an officer of that corporation, which is to say Scientology is a monolithic corporation. And I had pierced the corporate veil, as they say. That was used by the IRS, who then, of course, rolled over in 1993. It was used by Bent Corridon to get back his $2 million building. And hey, Bent, if you're out there, I'd still like to be paid my fee for that. It was 1991, mate. It was used in a variety of cases. Wallersheim used it as well to show you. But you then go to a court in England and you say, well, it's a monolithic corporation. And they go, no, this is this bit of this is this independent idea. So persuading, it's it was modeled on the Catholic Church that has little compartments. So if a diocese is sued, it can go bankrupt, and many have with the child abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, without losing the whole organization. And you can have this pretense that the Pope is not actually running things, that they're actually independent. They don't have to take what the Pope's direction. In the same way, Scientology pretends that they don't have to take David Miscavige's direction, which is not true. So you have to get past those hurdles. And the criminal cases, and 11 of them went to prison, including Mary Sue Hubbard, of course, Ron Hubbard's wife. 11 of them went to prison for kidnapping, false imprisonment, burglary, breaking and entering, massive theft, making government credentials, fake credentials, all of this stuff. The Guardian's Office case. That case also ran in Canada and was successful as a criminal case against Scientology. You'll see no record of that. It just sort of disappears unless you keep reminding people. I too, along the way, talked with a number of members of Parliament who had different points of view. And my sense was that while they generally meant well, they hadn't really understood what the problem was. I remember one MP in an interview telling me that, well, it's like strawberry jam. If you sell strawberry jam with no strawberries in it, then that's fraud. And so he wanted Scientology, to say it doesn't work, therefore. Whereas I'm still with the idea of the Coercive Control Act, but also of registering anybody who's working in psychotherapy. As it is the British Association of Counselling. Friends of mine who were independent Scientologists simply joined that group. All you did was pay a fee every year. There was no test of any kind of competence. And considering just how much psychological damage you can do to someone, I've worked with about 600 people in their recovery from Scientology over the years. Don't do very much of it anymore, but did a lot of it. And you can have somebody who's had a go of 20 years, has been housebound because of what had happened to him at the hands directly of L. Ron Hubbard. And it took an afternoon to get him back into the world. And it's one of those days in my life when I was furious at this thought of this waste of life, because Ron Hubbard had, turned this man against himself. In a single day, he'd managed to do this. So seeing the amount of harm and that so many people, because the word victim is a snarl word in Scientology, it's implanted as I'm not a victim. I'm not a victim. That's a bad thing. People find it very hard to say, yeah, I was a victim. I was exploited. My life was taken over, and my internal reality control was taken over. So I could no longer think for myself. I thought on the tram lines set by Ron Hubbard in Scientology. To undo that actually isn't that difficult. To get somebody to be willing to have it undone can take years, because people will find all sorts of excuses, which have, to some extent, are normal human ego defenses. I'm not wrong. I've not been fooled. I'm not gullible, that kind of stuff. But you've also got the very clever system of implanting, which is Scientology. And let me say this, I have, in the last 40 something years, I've studied the Chinese communist brainwashing system in more depth than most people do. I've not just read Robert J. Lifton, I've gone and looked a lot further. I've looked at the Russian system that it developed from. I've looked at MK Ultra and the CIA's system with its 158 or whatever sub operations. And I've talked with experts, and I'm absolutely confident in saying Scientology is much more invasive than any of those systems, because once you left the thought reform camp in China, if you were not in Chinese society, it would fade. What happens in Scientology, it's self-reinforcing. Hubbard found ways of getting us to maintain his belief system within our heads. And so you're in the middle of it, you can't see it. You can't see the wood for the trees because you're in it. So after I left, and I was an absolute true believer when I left Scientology, I wanted to maintain Scientology in the world. I thought it was a great thing. I'd been involved for 9 years. I'd done 5 of the OT levels. I'd done 6 auditor training courses. I'd done the data series evaluators course, all this stuff. And then I found out it was bogus. Bang, slap, just like that. I found out Ron Hubbard was a liar. And if he was a liar, it couldn't be true. Now, to me, that was a very simple thought, but to 90% of people, that's not enough. So what I then went was, I need to reject all of this. I don't, it's not right that I should, still believe in the ARC triangle or the 8 dynamics or what have you. I need to reject all of it and then look at it piecemeal and re-include these ideas. If any of them are good ideas, I want to re-include them. 41 years later, there isn't a single idea in Scientology that I hold. I can take apart anything that Hubbard said, including things like the cycle of action, which shows that he'd never looked the word cycle up, because cycle means something that repeats.
Yeah, but I think with everything, like I don't disagree with anything you said. Everything you said is 100% true. But these are all things that were raised in the 1970s in the Foster report. The Foster report explicitly says that this thing is damaging and can do harm. And so it was recognized, right, 50 years ago that something like Scientology would take a long time to recover. So I'm not discrediting anything you've said. I completely agree. But my question is, why hasn't something been done about it yet when we have a government inquiry raising these very valid concerns 50 years ago? Like what? And I don't accept the excuse that there's, the corporate veil and there's different companies and it's civil suit. Like I understand that. And I agree that is how Scientology operate. And I have come up head first with some of these groups and challenges myself. But I would like to think the UK government has a level of common sense where it can look at the picture and assess that there needs to be something done to get around these legal loopholes and corporate structures, because it's very clear we have a group of people here who are doing damage and abusing and harming people, irrespective of whether they call themselves this organization or this organization, or they operate in this country or this country. Like, surely there's some sort of system in place for the government to look at this with a bit of logic and go, we need to do something about this. Or is that the problem? Is the problem that that system doesn't exist?
Well, I think you first of all have to know what the target is, and if the target is 500 different corporations, then you have to deal with every one of those 500 corporations. And if there's not an acceptance in the courts, and this is what I've found, particularly in England, that you are dealing with a monolithic corporation, then you have to pick off every entity. So you have to go to Adelaide to deal with Cosrecki, or you have to go to LA to deal with Bridge Publications, or what have you. So firstly, that recognition that you are dealing with this single organization. From there, the other aspect of it is that psychotherapeutic organizations have done nothing. The people who should be protecting their territory have done nothing about this. Even though, and the responses have been variable. If you look right back to the beginning of Dianetics, Eric Fromm and Rollo May, both very significant figures in the world of psychotherapy, they condemned Dianetics immediately, and they showed why. You can look at the articles they wrote in 5051 explaining why it's not only not going to work, but it is going to do harm. No notice was taken of them. On the other side, Carl Rogers, the founder of humanistic psychology, person-centered, and Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy, they both made positive public statements about Hubbard and said maybe some of his therapies are good. So I think you've got a problem in that. My opinion is that many forms of psychotherapy are damaging. It's not simply Scientology. I deeply question psychoanalysis, the use of Freudian, Jungian, Adlerian, Reichian. Ferenczi is a different matter, but those four, I don't see how they can help people. And I have met people who are screwed up by years of therapy. So you've got this other problem, which is until the therapeutic community has any agreement within it, they are not acting to say, well, this thing is wrong, and we should have some safeguarding system. We should be monitored. And there is no organization. It's not like there's no British Medical Association, General Medical Council that has rights over psychotherapy. So to just say, well, right, we'll regulate this, it's a huge task. And you've got to get the agreement of the therapeutic community, the hypnotherapists and the cognitive behavioral therapists, all of this lot. So toes are being trodden on. And then I hate to put this into the picture, but you have political incentive. That we have seen absolute madness in our parliament since the idea of Brexit was proposed. We've seen lies and deception. We've seen idiots, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, the man who said, we've all had enough of experts. He did have Dominic Cummings working for him at the time, but we're not going to listen to people who know stuff. That's what the word expert means, Michael. So he was education secretary at the time, and he overruled all of the evidence that says that examinations are very bad for people, and that the highest literacy rates are found in the Baltic states and Scandinavia, where they don't do exams. They don't have SATs. They don't have, you're always being watched, you've always got to do stuff. The Finnish system, which usually comes out top every 2 years in the PISA tables, they have one exam in the whole 13 years of schooling. You have one final exam. They don't. So Gove reintroduces examinations at every level and drops all of the ongoing reports by teachers about how well kids are doing, because you can't trust teachers, can you? So there are attitudes in Parliament, and you've also got this kind of my party versus your party thing going on, and it's crazy. Yeah. So you need an MP who can take a single issue and introduce a private member's bill. So in the same way that David Steele introduced the abortion laws back in the 60s, you need Clement Freud, who's now discredited as a human being, but he introduced the Freedom of Information Act legislation. It's just one MP. year on, year up, getting some change to happen. And if you're lucky, we used to have the all parties working group on cults in Parliament. So MPs from whichever party could come together and discuss what should be done. Unfortunately, the consequence of that, the only consequence, was the creation of Inform, which proved to be pretty much a pro-cult cult monitoring organization, an academic organization where, what in fact the European Parliament had ruled when we were still bound by the European Parliament was that there should be cult information given in every member state. It was mandated by law, and what we got was Inform. And when it was shown, when Eileen Barker was shown that she'd had 14 trips paid for by the Moonies, 5-star trips, that she claimed that hadn't influenced her in any way. Now, she's a sociologist, so she probably wouldn't know about psychology, but psychology says if people give you a lot of stuff, you'll tend to reciprocate. It's called the reciprocity principle, but it's not found in sociology. It's Cialdini in psychology. And so you had somebody, and of course there was a private meeting that she had with Gordon J. Melton, where they agreed that they needed Mooney money to support their activities, and that they were pleased that they were killing off the anti-cult movement. Jeffrey Maddow, I think, was the other member of, Geoffrey Haddon, I think, was the other member of this. That report went to the All Parties Working Group. They saw this memo of this terrible meeting, and they kept giving money to Inform. So finding people who understand what the problem is, which is, as you said, that people are being put under coercive control or manipulated, brainwashed, put under mind control, thought reform, whichever term we use, that is a very real and demonstrable process, and that we need to protect our citizenry, all of our citizenry, not simply from Scientology, but from any of the hundreds of groups that are functioning in this country. The way that the Jehovah's Witnesses, or the Plymouth Brethren, or the Moonies, or the Krishnas, groups that use techniques that induce euphoric states, very good indicators, as Scientology has it, so that people's judgment is impaired and people will do things that are against their best interests. All of these groups, our problem, the other side of that, is religion, that people have, you can believe what you like, and of course you should be able to. But if that inclines you towards self-destructive behavior, or behavior that's destructive to others, then maybe we should put some limits on it. So if you volunteer for a monastic life, then that doesn't mean, you take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience in a Christian monastery or convent. That shouldn't mean that you don't have human rights. You should still have, and indeed, I'm told that in this country, monasteries pay the national insurance so there'll be a pension, later on. They have healthcare. There should be a minimum set of standards which would apply to the staff in Scientology organizations, as well as certain rules about the defense of human rights and the right to freedom of mind, as opposed to just freedom of thought, the right to not have your mind invaded and overtaken by anything from Elon Musk to Scientology. Or is it Elron Musk? I'm not sure about that anymore.
No, I get what you mean. And I think this is what you're doing, is beautifully painting the picture of the challenges that I am facing in my activism, going to meet with these politicians, because there are so many people who are reluctant to even approach the subject because they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot barge pole. They don't want to be the politician that decides what you can and can't believe in. And so I've really tried to approach it with okay, well, let's, as a starting point, separate beliefs from behaviors. It's okay if they want to believe in L. Ron Hubbard technology. But if in applying that, they are harming people, for example, forcing people to have abortions, or, you know, trafficking children around the world, or putting people on hard manual labor, locking children in rooms and forcing them to do confessions, this sort of thing, families being disconnected, that is, if believing it results in that activity, that's where the problem lies. But I'm just trying to say, well, look, how do we apply the existing laws in a way that they are applied to Scientology? Because at the moment, Scientology escape a lot of it by going, oh, it's our religious belief, or it's our practice. And so people don't, and they have such a big litigious nature, people don't want to approach it. And then when you see things where there's scope for the law to change, for example, the coercive control thing, it's like it's already illegal to coercively control someone through a religious, you know, using religion as an excuse. But it only applies to the domestic partnership or a family member. And so it's, for me, I see this as an opportunity to let's adapt the existing legislation, which government already agrees is a harmful thing to do. And then by applying it, not by name to Scientology, but by, you know, as a group, or your relationship with a pastor, or relationship with a minister, or something like that, that then opens it up for government or law enforcement, whoever, to then start looking at Scientology's behaviors and other cults too, and look at whether their behavior amounts to what is now illegal, being coercive control. And I think that will open the floodgates for hopefully a lot of justice, and it will force a lot of groups and cults to change. Or in a lot of cases, like with Scientology, you can't change what L. Ron Hubbard wrote. So they're going to have a real tough time on their hands. You know, if they're saying you can't coercively control someone, and there's a court case that comes out with a conclusion that security checks, auditing, and ethics conditions all amount to coercive control, well, there is no Scientology left after that. So it would be a real predicament for them. But that's the change that needs to happen in order for that conversation to happen with change makers, is you need to get the law to be more aligned with understanding coercive control. That's just my thought anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And there's another element to it. When the Lisa McPherson case was being investigated, Lisa McPherson had bipolar disorder, and she had a manic episode, jumped out of a car, zipped her clothes off, and ended up in a psychiatric hospital. And she was taken out of the hospital by her fellow Scientologists, and she wound up dead from dehydration in the Clearwater headquarters of Scientology. And it was shown that she had ligature marks on her wrists and ankles. She'd been kept tied up, and she had died of not having enough water. This was under the direction of David Miscavige, we have no doubt. And I talked with a journalist back then, and she said that, firstly, she said that she found 8 other unusual deaths at the Flagland base.
Well, and look at France. There are a number of cases fairly recently, within the last decade, where there were some suspicious deaths that France looked into. And, you know, Scientology is on a list of cults now with Miviludes, and they are considered all part of this dangerous cultic movement. So the government keep a very close eye on Scientology. Suspicious deaths are a thing that has happened and will continue to happen until something is done about it. And that's my point, is when we have a report in the 1970s that say, watch out, this is what this group does. We have a high court case in the 1980s that said this is dangerous. Why wasn't something done back then?
Well, it's the other part of it. I talked with the journalist at the time of the original Lisa McPherson investigation in the early 90s, and she told me that she'd found 8 other cases, but she also said because she was an experienced journalist, she'd actually won a Pulitzer for another story along the way, and so she knew the district attorney. And she went to the district attorney and just they were friends. She said point blank, why aren't you investigating this? And his response was, I don't want anybody counting the number of Scotch bottles in my trash. Now, this is an aspect we have to be aware of, that Operation Snow White, this massive infiltration operation, part of the point of what Hubbard's organization, Branch 1 within the Guardian's office, the harassment division, covert data collection, part of what they were doing was finding blackmail material on politicians. So if you trigger that and you start going, well, they've got quite a reputation for noisy investigation, for going after people. So a politician has to say, do I have the mettle? Am I able to stand up to the harassment? Now, it's a lot less than it used to be, believe me. I had 16 years of it on a daily basis, something or other always happening. But they will find out everything about that person and they will make it public. That's the way they function. Scientology is an intelligence agency. Religion is just a cover for the intelligence agency. It's a way of psychologically enslaving people and physically enslaving people. But getting that over, you need somebody who's very resolute and who's kind of single issue. Mike Rinder, when he had negotiated the deal with the Internal Revenue Service that they wouldn't tax Scientology, and you go, it's ludicrous. I went through, there were amazing rulings that the IRS got, which absolutely proved that the money flowed straight into Ron Hubbard's pockets. Hubbard leaves $648 million, no part of it taxed. And the IRS took $12 million, which can't be a proper portion, and said, okay, as Hubbard's dead, the money's not going to him anymore, so we'll give you tax exemption. Mike Rinder, when questioned about this, told me that it was just to do with harassment. It was just too much trouble. Scientology is such a tiny thing, with perhaps 25,000 paid up members, that their taxes didn't matter. When I met with the IRS in Reno in 1991, after the agent had decided, I published a book, but it took him a while to decide that I wasn't working for them. And he said confidentially, this is the first organization that more than 1,000 agents have been assigned to. Even taking down Al Capone didn't take anything like this. And where are we getting? We're not going to make any money from it. It's costing the taxpayer a fortune. So they rolled over. So you've got that attitude in government of, is it a battle worth fighting? So what people can do, and I'd be willing to provide it free of charge in the e-form, but I wrote a booklet called Scientology, the Cult of Greed, to explain Scientology and its worst aspects in simple, straightforward terms to anybody who'd not been involved. I wrote Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky to help people come out of the conditioning of Scientology, which is incredibly elaborate, not as simple as it seems. But I wrote that book for former members as a kind of way of destimulating and recovering, digesting. But Scientology, Cult of Greed, very short, was written for people who don't know. It would be a good idea if every MP got a copy of this. And I say, I'm willing to provide it as an e-copy free of charge to them all, so that they understand what it is, because you have to start there. And just reading Hubbard talking about hard selling and how people are in a hypnotic daze so you can do what you like with them, it's pretty evident that you've got something that's quite dangerous here. His attitudes about Christianity, Christ is an implant, yet you can be a Christian and be a Scientologist, these kind of awful contradictions. Getting some idea of that, if people wrote to their MPs and maintained a dialogue with their MPs saying, if it does alarm you, this alarms me, to your congressman, to your MP, to whoever, to keep some pressure on and say, this is a significant issue. And you are right. The bigger issue is not Scientology. The bigger issue is that this is happening all through our society, outside of familial relationships. We need these controls in the military. I'm currently involved with the Ockenden review of the Nottingham University Hospital's maternity units. There have more than 2,000 families have complained. More than 800 staff have complained. 426 mothers and babies have died. This is the biggest scandal in the history of medicine in the United Kingdom. And yet, what are we going to do about it? And what it says is our whole society needs safeguarding against bullying and coercion. That this has gone on I mean, my daughter's case goes back 12 years. And at a meeting the other week where we had the General Medical Council and the the Midwives Trust, they stood up and said, oh, we're going to do everything we can about this. And I stood up and said, it's been 12 years. How many doctors and midwives have you suspended? There was an awful silence. And the answer is none. We're seeing problems with safeguarding in our churches. Abuse, sexual abuse particularly, or SA, I'm supposed to say on YouTube, aren't I? Euphemisms, wonderful things. But abuse within the churches, we need safeguarding, and we need adequate safeguarding where experts, people who really know about subjects and will not be, they won't be part of the white coat conspiracy, or if it's the police, the blue coat conspiracy, they will serve the people and the law. And Scientology is one small part of the problem of coercion in our schools, in our government, in our hospitals, in the police force, throughout our society. And the law that if we could reduce just the amount of bullying, we've seen so many politicians, of course, John Bercow, the extraordinarily funny Speaker of the House, had to back off. Alex Salmond had 13 people charging him with things. Politicians are being accused of abuse and bullying. We need checks and balances there as well, because while you've got people who behave in this way, they will protect others who behave the same way, just as they have for at least 12 years in the Nottingham University hospitals. So, but we need to it's not just you're doing great work. Everybody who's watching this, write to your congressman, your MP, or whoever, and say, I'm really worried about Scientology. And John Atack says he'll send you a free copy of his ebook if you like.
Yeah. And I think, and I thank you. And I think kindness and compassion is so important with everything that I do. And, I make it very clear in my meetings with journalists, with politicians that, hey, look, I'm not doing this because I have an axe to grind and I want to take down Scientology because they abused me. For me, I'm almost defending Scientology in a way, in that I'm saying that people have a right and a freedom to choose whatever belief system they want to. And I don't have an issue with that. I just have an issue with the behavior. And, whether you can have the belief without the behavior is a whole nother topic. I might disagree with the belief of Scientology, and I might personally believe that practicing Scientology is innately harmful. However, that doesn't mean that I'm going to ask a politician to outright ban someone's right to choose that faith. But what I am asking politicians and journalists to do is to look at the way they're behaving and treating people, and say, hey, look, this organization should not be allowed to do X, Y, Z. That doesn't mean they necessarily shouldn't exist. And I think by taking that approach with kindness and compassion and saying, hey, look, I just want to help people escape and leave. If they want to leave and they want to set up their own, life outside of Scientology, I want to create a community of people that can support them. But we're not going to go and harass and go after people who don't want to leave and want to be Scientologists. That's their right. And by leading with kindness, I think goes a long way, because it shows, hey, look, we're offering help if they want it. And if they don't want it, then that's fine. But I think society as a whole needs to be more kind and more compassionate, I think, completely irrespective of the Scientology question. But
I think that's true. And I often quote Dave Matthews, who said, with kindness as your king, you will reach heaven before you reach your end. I do believe that compassion and humility are the basis of a decent life, and where society, to be a society means to have regard for other people, to be social. I will take up one point though, which is, while I absolutely agree, and Justice Leahy talked about, if people want to believe the earth is flat, they can, so the belief is fine. But what about if somebody then hypnotizes you to believe the earth is flat?
Exactly.
That's behavior. And unfortunately, all of Scientology, every last scrap of it, is a way of guiding somebody's imagination. And so harm is being done by the practice of Scientology. So if people want to believe they're Thetans and they've lived for 76 trillion years or however long. Excuse me. That's fine. But if people then want to sit down and do 2 hours of book and bottle, I think you've already crossed a line. So it's not just their outward behavior in harassing critics, it's the very procedures of Scientology which are damaging to the human being.
I absolutely agree. And it's even more dangerous when you think about we're in a world now where the majority of Scientologists are second or third generation. And so they've had no choice but to be brought up in Scientology. And so they don't know anything different. And that's, I think, another aspect which makes it more harmful. If you grow up believing that you are a Thetan and all of this stuff, you know, you don't realize that there are perhaps other interpretations or other ways of thinking, because Scientology is totalitarian, it's extremist. There is no room for other types of belief. So if you're raised in that, it becomes very, very hard to understand that there are other ways of thinking, and therefore you become even more ingrained into it, and therefore it's more damaging. And when you want to leave, and that means you have to disconnect from your family and everything you've ever known and ever loved, then it's a really harmful thing. And anyway, that's a whole nother live stream. But should we start looking through some of these questions and comments that I've been starring as we've been going through?
Oh, let's do it.
Hans Christian Schwartz is saying hello. We have Kirby's mum. Hi, Alex. Hi, John. Hi, Hans. Edgycon says my 2 favorite SPs.
There you go.
What else we got here? We've got Freudian Slip and Slide says my mum has been a Jehovah's Witness since I was 15, but I grew up Catholic. Yeah, and that's the thing with what I've been doing, is it's not just Scientology. If we would, with coercive control, that legislative change will impact every cult and group in the country, and only in a positive way in terms of people seeking justice, right?
And my work has not been centered on Scientology since 1996. I keep coming back and commenting, but I've written about terrorism and appeared at conferences and talked about terrorism. I also wrote a book called Opening Our Minds to show that coercive control is a commonplace through many aspects of our society, and we need to address that. You know, and that our schools, unfortunately, it's not simply that people growing up in a particular cloistered belief, you know, like the Plymouth Brethren or Scientology, where they don't have access to outside ideas. Our schools are not teaching anything about this, anything. They're not teaching about how to make relationship, how to communicate, how to spot predators, which is central to my idea that there are people who are human predators. And you can spot them. Their characteristics are rather obvious, but they need to be delineated, and you need to learn them. You know, we on our site and my website, we've got a little thing you can print out and stick on your fridge, which says, look for these things. But kids, you know, my friend Ira Chalef, his wonderful courageous followership and intelligent disobedience, this idea that he was giving a talk one day and somebody said, oh, I've got what you're talking about under the desk in front of me. And then he said, what? He brought out a guide dog that she was training. She said the guide dog has to have intelligent disobedience. If they're leading a blind person, the blind person is just about to walk into something, the dog has to say no. And why don't we teach our children intelligent disobedience? Why have we got a society that is about obedience and groupthink? Is there some danger in people actually thinking? I personally don't think so. But we demand conformity in our society. So it's in the education system that it starts. And we need to massively improve that. And part of that would be teaching kids that coercive control is wrong.
Yeah.
You know, even if it's your teacher doing it, you know. Yeah.
100%. Salty Beach Girl Laurie says, good morning / afternoon, you two SP warriors. I don't know if you I found this hilarious when I was protesting outside the Paris Ideologue last year. The magazine newspaper Charlie Hebdo did this big piece on the protest and on the opening of this new Ideologue, and they labeled me, Apostate Alex, the Scientology slayer which I thought was quite a fun title. I might have to start using it.
It's weird. I've tried to. I mean, Jerry Armstrong, in 10 years ago, we did this great conference in Toronto, Getting Clear of Scientology, and Jerry criticized me from the floor. Jerry was Hubbard's archivist. He's a brilliant man, done a great deal to help people in escaping from Scientology. But he criticized me because I said I don't consider Scientologists my enemies. I'm not at war with anybody. I am a pro-Scientologist, and I always have been. I have done everything I've done to help Scientologists. And Jerry said, you've got to accept that they treat you as an enemy, so it is a war, and this, that, and the other. And I sat down with him after the talk, and he challenged me on the floor. I sat down with him and said, if there'd ever been a moment where I felt that Scientologists were my enemies, I would have stopped doing this, because I can't work from that basis. I'm here to understand that even L. Ron Hubbard and David Miscavige had experiences that led them to be complete and utter bastards, and that there might be redemption even for, it's a bit late for Ron. He's been scattered over the Pacific Ocean now, which was a good end for him, I think. But David Miscavige, I've said it again and again, if he wants to call me up, as long as he doesn't shout at me and call me names, I'm happy to have a cup of tea with him.
Well, I think, but I think there's a fine line between hearing someone out, seeing them as a human, and having a conversation and being kind, irrespective of someone's severe dislike of you. Then I think that's different to saying someone has redeemable qualities. I think Dave Miscavige is beyond redemption. If you look at the amount of harm and abuse that he has been a part of and in control of, I don't think it's possible for him to turn around, and for people, it's people's choice if they want to forgive someone or not, and they are well within their right to decide that they don't ever want to forgive their abuser, and that's absolutely fine if they want to do that. But I think that doesn't mean we shouldn't have kindness and compassion for certain people. Like I was saying to someone the other day about my friends at London Org, who are now no longer my friends because they've disconnected from me. They look at me as an enemy. They will be playing a key part in my destruction through fair game, and that's horrible. But that doesn't mean that if they were to leave, I would hate them. It's, I still look at them as friends and would do anything to support them. And if a Scientologist knocked on my door and said, hey, can we just have a debate about why we disagree, I would love that, because yes, I'm not going to try and convince you, but I want to say my point, and I will listen to you saying your point. But that doesn't happen in Scientology. You're not allowed to debate and discuss.
No, it's verbal tech. It's against the law. You can communicate freely with anyone on any topic as long as they're not an SP, as long as you're not talking about your case, as long as you're not talking about Scientology, freely with anyone on any subject. It's the first level of Scientology. I would like to point out that redemption and forgiveness are quite distinct things.
Yeah.
But a person can redeem themselves without being forgiven.
Yes.
So, and the case I would point to is Jeffrey Dahmer. And if you look to the last interviews with Jeffrey Dahmer, who was, of course, a serial killer who ate his victims, his last interviews seem to show that he had achieved some kind of redemption. So, and I'm not going to forgive him. It's not my place to forgive him. But the same with David Miscavige, that, having talked with his dad, Ron Miscavige, there's an interview on my channel with Ron. Ron was an absolutely lovely human being. How on earth did he produce this child? And then you find out about the struggles with hydrocortisone, because he nearly died from an asthma attack as a kid. You find out that he had no education. He was 13 when he left school. He becomes a cameraman at 17 in Hubbard's unit. And when you talk about second generation and it being different for second generation, well, it is. And it was different. I met his brother, Ronnie. Obviously, his niece, Jenna, is a lovely person. Something happened to David Miscavige. And so while I always felt that Ron Hubbard should go to prison, but I still believed in redemption for him. It's not that this person should not suffer the consequences and be kept away from society so they can't do further harm. But nonetheless, having hatred, and so using metaphors of battle and being a warrior, a slayer, and these kind of things, they seem to me to be, dangerous places to go, that we need to put compassion into everything we say and all the descriptions we give of the work we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Cult Vault here says, we are so lucky to have the likes of John in this world. Absolutely. And you're a wealth of knowledge.
Yes. Thank you so much. And it's good having my friends commenting under their pseudonyms.
Yes, there we go. Storm Pugglesworth says, if you say you've got a BSc in psychology, would a Scientologist still recruit you? Now, I don't know, John, if your answer to this is going to be different to my answer because of the times that we were in Scientology. My answer
depends how much money you've got.
Well, yeah, there we go. My answer was going to be probably because they're desperate for any sort of money. If you were walking into an org and said, I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and I'm interested in learning about Scientology, they certainly would be suspicious and they certainly would approach with caution, but they absolutely would take your money and recruit you onto a life improvement course if they could in their own mind satisfy that you're not a psych that's going undercover to expose Scientology. So say you happen to do a psychology degree, but that's just because that's what your parents told you to do, and you're actually, your real job is an actor or something, then they probably would use that to justify allowing you on course. But if you are a practicing psychologist or psychiatrist and you go into an org and you are there because you want to learn more about how it works, that you would be swiftly shown the door. I don't know about what it was like in your time, John.
Well, I'm not sure it'd be any different now. The rules about psychiatry would begin in the early 50s after Hubbard was assessed rather negatively for his second wife. You remember the second wife he didn't have, according to his interview on Shrinking World of Scientology. She had the cheek to have a psychiatrist review him. And up until then, people don't tend to know the first 5 Dianetic Foundations, 2 of them were run by psychologists. Hubbard was courting psychologists. But in, one of my, a guy I used to know very well was Dr. Frank Gabodi, usually known as Sarge Gabodi, the name given to him by his dad when he was a kid. And Sarge was a psychiatrist. Sarge is a psychiatrist who for 14 years was involved with Scientology, ran the mission of Palo Alto, and then splintered and set up, it was first of all the Advanced Ability Center. David Mayo, the most famous independent Scientologist, worked for him there. That's where I interviewed David many years ago. And he then, curiously at my suggestion, changed the name to metapsychology. I was at his house and he'd got the complete works of Freud, and there was this wonderful word metapsychology, which I saw in the beginning of the book. And so I suggested they change the name to that, and they did. And they're still called metapsychology. I can't remember what they used to be, the Institute for Research into Metapsychology. They aren't that anymore. But so, yeah, he was a psychiatrist who for 14 years was in Scientology, ran a mission for Scientology. And he'd been doing fairly extreme experimental investigation as a psychiatrist, as I recollect. And he's a brilliant man, very well versed in forms of psychotherapy. And here you're dealing with the real enemy. The psychologist, well, that's soft. What does that mean? Psychiatrists are the people who deal with the mentally ill. And this is where psychic surgery and electroconvulsive therapy, which I do disagree with, by the way, by becoming, by our position to Scientology, I still hold that the psychic surgery of the 50s and the kind of 60s, the one flew over the cuckoo's nest version of psychiatry, it did happen. It was evil. Yeah. But
that doesn't mean it happens now, and that doesn't mean that it's all psychiatry is bad. That's where Scientology becomes an extremist belief system, because they don't have the ability to admit that some psychiatrists nowadays can be helpful, right? Some psychiatrists will prescribe medication, some won't. Some people do need psychiatric support, whether that's low level, just therapy and counseling, or whether it's with medication. Psychiatrists as a whole, there are a lot of them that do good work. Yeah, there are some that do bad work, but there's no room for that nuance in Scientology. It's all psychiatrists are bad, unless you're one of those psychiatrists that we could pay off to sign a document to say that Scientology is good.
Well, and they had Thomas Satz, who I don't think they paid off. I think Thomas Satz was thoroughly genuine. And they had Peter Breggin, who again, I think had a, his opposition to psychiatry is still valid. I don't agree that the problem's gone away. But I would also say that from the beginning of psychiatry in the 19th century, when alienists changed their name to psychiatrists, there have always been good people. Pierre Janet, who was Sigmund Freud's contemporary, put forward a brilliant scheme of the mind. And but yeah, as you say, there's this the process which Hubbard would call identification, which is meant to be a very low level thing. All psychiatrists, all psychologists, all the rapists, the funny joke they make, all psychotherapists, anybody who in fact has the word psyche, meaning spirit, at the beginning of their title, is part of an evil conspiracy to overthrow all life in the universe, as Ron Hubbard said. The ridiculous, I mean, I've said this often enough before, if you have two rabbis in a room, you have three opinions. I've met a fair few psychiatrists in my time, and I would say the same thing is true, that the idea that they're all in conspiracy, let alone adding all the psychologists who've got, and the therapists who've got their warring schools and all this, it's just silly. But it is still the case, unfortunately, that the treatment of the mentally ill is not adequate in our society. It's not properly funded in our society. It's still the case that some psychiatrists will have a heart of gold and be decent and wonderful people, and some psychiatrists will be sadistic bastards. And both of these things exist. Psychic surgery has diminished massively. We are now, however, still hearing about brain implants, which in the case of hyperaggression, people who just can't stop getting into fights, might be an idea to have something that twinks and goes, oh, stop. Maybe, I don't know. That's difficult. Electroconvulsive therapy is largely confined to major chronic depression now. And I'm still hesitant about its use, because you are putting electricity through living cells, killing cells. I have never quite, thought that was a good idea. So the excesses that built to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and it's worth knowing that brilliant film, the guy who heads the Psychiatric Institute, it was filmed in the Psychiatric Institute. The head of the institute plays the head of the institute. So he agreed with the criticism that was being made by Ken Kesey and Milos Forman, the director. And so these things did happen. This is a part of history. The Siberia bill, which Hubbard went on about in the early 50s, this is pretty much made up. And as you say, this identification that all of this group of people are evil is a nonsense. You'll have the whole range of types and personalities there. And the thing that's worth saying about Scientology in this context is that Scientology has only one technique, the PTS type 3 handling, for people who are crazy. And I did a video with Mike Rinder about it and one with Karen Carrier, because they were there when this test case won the case that Hubbard cured insanity with. And he basically, what had happened was a guy threatened to kill him. And so he had him locked up, and Mike was guarding him, and Karen was pushing notes under the door to him. And Hubbard came out of this and said, oh, I've done it. I've cured insanity. All you have to do is cut off all communication. And the person, there was no follow-up. The guy was let off the ship, and nobody bothered to see what had happened. And this is the cure for insanity. That's all Scientology has. You exclude the person from society and they'll get better. This is obviously stupid nonsense,
And nowadays, every staff member, myself included, have to sign a document to say that if I'm ever mentally incapacitated, not only do I give permission, but I want Scientology to come and take me out of the psychiatric hospital and assume care for me. That is what every Scientology staff member has to sign now. and approve of sound mind of the introspection rundown. I remember as a 15-year-old child, when I was signing this document, I was like, what is the introspection rundown? Because I don't know if I want to sign this. And they said, oh, it's just like, you know, it's a Scientology way of dealing with psychotic breaks, but it's not something that really has to be done very often, because Scientology prevents you from having psychotic breaks. But this is just to protect you from the evil psychs getting you. And surely you agree it's better to get auditing than it is to get psychiatric drugs pumped into your blood system. And as a 15-year-old kid, I go, yeah, okay, yeah, I can agree with that. I don't want to, you know, have drugs pumped into my body if I'm ever in a space of mental despair. So yeah, take me out of there. I don't want that to happen to me. Not really fully understanding what it is.
Yeah, and thankfully that was not a legal contract, because you were not of an age to offer a legal contract. But
Exactly.
and I hope your parents didn't sign it.
Nope.
No. So it was just a piece of coercion and trickery on their part. But yeah, they have, and I mean, I'm writing a book at the moment called "If Scientology Ruled the World," and it's a fascinating thought. Well, something like, I know John Sweeney is very much of that opinion, and I've read certain stuff about North Korea along the way too. It's a wonderful book called "Dear Leader," by the former poet laureate.
I've got it just here. Yeah. It's a great book.
Yeah, it's a brilliant book. But Scientology, there are very specific things that would happen. And the first is, of course, I'm making a comparison between Scientology and the Nazis, and between the occult systems that affected the Nazis, between the idea of Aryan race theory, which is a complete and absolute genetic nonsense. It comes from the work of a guy called Ignatius Loyola Donnelly via Madame Blavatsky, Rudolf Steiner, and directly into the tool group that founded the Nazis. So I've been thinking about these things recently. One of the first things that Scientology would do is exactly what the Nazis did. When the Nazis, well, perhaps not exactly, when the Nazis invaded foreign countries, the mental hospitals were emptied. Now, their method of doing that was to slaughter everybody inside them, so that they could use these hospitals for their own wounded troops. But their justification was, well, these are imperfect people, get rid of them. I think that the first thing, if David Miscavige was world leader, that all of the psychiatric institutes, it'd be rather like what's been happening in the last few weeks in America anyway. They would close down all of the psychiatric hospitals. They wouldn't offer any other form of care.
And it's part of eliminate the enemy as well, isn't it? Destroy your opponents. And Scientology fully believe that psychiatrists are their opponents. And that's because psychiatrists, psychologists, people who have actually studied the mind, recognize and understand the harm that Scientology can do. So they're quite right in identifying them as potential enemies. And so I agree with you. One of the first things they would do would be to completely eradicate the world of the people that disagree with them, first being psychiatrists. But that's a whole nother topic for a whole different stream. I've got two more comments.
Let me just add something to that, which is that it is surprising how few psychiatrists have taken exception to Scientology. In this country, Betty Tilden, who was incredible and a wonderful person, she's the only psychiatrist I know of in the last 40 years to have been active. And she was harassed, something rotten. In the US, you had John Clark, who founded the American Family Foundation, which is now ICSA. You had Jolly West, who suffered tremendous attacks. I've been attacked for saying he was a friend of mine. Well, he was a friend of mine, and he was tremendously supportive. And he stood up against Hubbard in 1951 and never stopped standing up. He actually gave a talk to the American Psychiatric Association annual meeting and said, they're trying to get me to stop. I'm not going to stop. But they're the only two psychiatrists I can think of in the US. And you had
well, John,
so very few people. This is a community that should be active and aren't saying this is
Yeah, I think you need to spend some more time looking on Twitter then, my friend, because there are several psychiatrists and psychologists who follow me and who I follow on Twitter that are subject to a constant bombardment of OSA trolls, attacks, harassment, simply because they are psychiatrists and psychologists who have perhaps retweeted something negative about Scientology, or have mentioned, you know, the Narconon Center being dangerous or something along those lines.
This is fine, Alex, but how many of them have formed an organization like the American Family Foundation or the Cult Awareness Network? How many of them have got together to do something?
Oh, no,
I'm not talking about people saying something, you know, that's
I agree there's scope.
Yeah,
I agree there's scope for them to do more in the way of challenging Scientology, but I was disagreeing with your point that they don't go after psychiatrists as much.
Oh no, I'm not saying they don't go after. I didn't say that at all. What I'm saying is that psychiatrists don't go after them in an adequate way.
Right.
And
yeah.
That isn't just table talk on Twitter. It's kind of organizations that will do something.
I 100% agree.
Yeah, I mean, the response that John Clark and Margaret Singer and Jolly got was just horrific. Jolly was sued and sued and sued, and now, of course, is being accused by Tom O'Neill of having run MK Ultra and caused the Manson family to come into being, which is absolute nonsense. I also have a book on Manson that's largely researched, showing that he was a Scientologist. No two ways about it. And they managed to cover that up using the Guardian's office. But that's another live stream. Sorry, you had some other comments you wanted.
Yeah, we've got two more. One is from Hartley Patterson that says Inform is remarkably badly informed, and I think that's
the truth. Yeah.
Yes. And
finally, I mean, I went to Inform and in about 91, 92, not long after they were founded, and sugared up Eileen Barker and said how great I thought her book New Religious Movements was, which it was. It was a good piece of work. Pointed out that she'd made some mistakes about Scientology. I said what they were. I didn't say you spelt his name right and you got the right year of birth, but that's about it. I didn't think that would be popular. And from then on, for 3 or 4 years, I got all of the referrals. And what Inform was doing up to that time was, if somebody complained about Scientology, they'd send them to St. Hill, to the chaplain. So just by love bombing, let's use that expression, Eileen Barker, I got all of the Scientology traffic for several years, which didn't do me any good because none of them paid me any money.
And finally, Tim Greenglass says, credit card fraud is the way to go. I think this is when we were talking about the different ways of going after Scientology, and you can go after it from a health perspective or from a coercive control perspective. And yeah, let's, you know, we don't need to have a big, long discussion about it, but I think it's true. There is the fraud angle as well, and the money of Scientology, and the extortion and the elder abuse. There are so many facets to this organization that all tread the line between legal and illegal very, very closely, and there are places where they have slipped up in the past.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Brown's work on elder abuse is incredibly important, and I think what he's done is amazing. And Jeffrey Augustine, the Scientology Money Project, just amazing work that Jeffrey's done, just following the money and showing. As the comment says, that credit card fraud is one of the significant ways to go in terms of criminal prosecution. But you still got this slippery fish. Which organization, which individuals, who's going to be prosecuted, who did this? And one thinks it's probably going to be like the Yakuza in Japan. They will offer up a 14-year-old sacrifice to go to prison while David Miscavige continues to drink Blue Mountain coffee made with distilled water with his Ventolin inhaler in one hand and his cigarette in the other hand.
Well, that's why we have such beautiful legislation in the UK that only recently came into effect. As of the beginning of this year, Companies House legislation means that you have to register a beneficial owner of a company, even if because this law came in to try and get the Russian oligarchs that you know weren't complying with sanctions, but it will apply to something like Scientology, right? So wherever you are registered, if you are doing business in the UK, you have to register with Companies House, and if your you have a beneficial owner. So the person who is, for all intents and purposes, in control of the organization, even if they are not on the paperwork, they're not a shareholder, but ultimately what they say goes, then they have to be registered as the beneficial owner, even if they're not actually on paper the owner of the organization. And the reason is because they want to be able to go after people like Russian oligarchs who have so many different systems of companies owning companies and shell companies and so on, that they escape accountability. So they put this law in and said, look, we just want to know who is the oligarch in charge of these companies so that we can trace everything and track it and make sure everything is above board. Now, Scientology are yet to put Dave Miscavige as the beneficial owner of any of their UK registered entities, but they need to. And if they don't comply, legislation exists that can go after Scientology in the States simply for not registering the beneficial owner. And it's looking at legislation like this and how it can be applied to Scientology, I think, is really important.
I think it is, but as the Foster report points out in 1971, Companies House was derelict in its duties and did not pursue COSRECI, which was the agency, is still the agency in this country. I certainly found in the 80s and 90s that was still happening, that they were not filing proper accounts and that nobody was going after them. You also have the problem of consultancy, that the way that WorldCom and Enron, great scandals of the past, functioned was that they would set up a distinct corporation, which was, let's say, a pension fund. They would collect money into it. They would pay all the money out of it as consultancy fees to a separate corporation. This is how Scientology works. All of the organizations run at a slight loss because of the massive consultancy fees they have to pay. Absolutely. If those fees are going through the Netherlands Antilles or the Cayman Islands or one of these many places that are still, there are even states in the US, you can't trace them. You can insist on something. So it's the amount of muscle that would be required, the amount of time that would be required on the part of the English system, or the UK system rather, to pursue them. And how big a fish are they and how much money is involved? And because COSRECI is in collapse, the United Kingdom organization is what, the 2021 census, 1,100 Scientologists in the whole of the UK. And that's, of course, everybody who's got a brother. 1,800, sorry. But less than 2,000 in the whole of the UK. How many Jedi were there that year? It's over 200,000, wasn't it?
No, that was the year before. There were like 200,000 in the 2001 census, or 2011 and 2021 census was much less. There was, as far as I'm aware, more Scientologists than Jedi Knights in the last census. But nonetheless, it's not about the number.
I contest that. I think that's absolutely wrong, Alex. How dare you suggest that there are less Jedi? I mean, there are obviously less Sith because we are badly represented. But
we'll double check. But
I think they peaked at about over 300,000 in 2000.
Yeah, it was 300,000 in the 2001 census, but there were definitely less Jedi in the 2011 census and the 2021 census. There were less because it was a one-year thing. But regardless, my point with Scientology is it's not about how many people there are. It's about the money, the power, the control, and the influence. And we have the largest Scientology event in Europe taking place at St. Hill every year, which makes millions of dollars for this organization. The UK COSRECI, which is actually based in Australia but operates exclusively here, is $100 million in debt to its US counterparts. The average donation for one Scientologist per year is about £25,000. And on top of that, you've got all of this money that is completely unaccounted for in Scientology's UK accounts, which is all the IES donations, the money it makes through the IES event, and so on and so forth. And that's where people's ears start to prick up when they look at it as, okay, it's not about how many people have ticked the form. Let's not forget that the religion question on the census is optional, so it's not necessarily accurate. I believe most Scientologists would have answered that question. However,
all of them will, and all of their dogs and brothers and sisters as well.
However, it's about the power and influence and money that they have, and for 1,800 people, that's a lot of money and that's a lot of influence per capita. It's more, Scientology is a wealthier religion than the Mormons per capita.
Okay. Yeah, it's going to be the balance of how much money is that compared to, say, how much money Donald Trump made from cryptocurrency in a week, first week of his presidency, which was $6 billion. And the oligarchs, you're talking in tens of billions. So it is going to be down to whether the tax authorities think it's worth doing something about it. And it probably requires a working group in Parliament to be saying, these are the many ways in which this group and various other extremist authoritarian sects function. And we need to restrict that. We need to restrict, looking at the amounts of cash. Scientology the recruitment is collapsing ever since South Park. So for quite some time now. As you said, that it's second generation, third generation born-ins who are now staffing the thing. So it is in collapse. But then you get somebody like Trish Duggan giving them $360 million.
Yeah.
And it's that's the point where we need civil suits against them, class actions against them, to actually have punitive damages, which you wouldn't have here. But in the US, with punitive damages, you could strip out some of the billions that Miscavige has squirreled away, excuse me using that word, in the Netherlands Antilles, in his living trust, and in the Building Investment Committee and the various other places he's put money. That sort of thing. The thing that Wollersheim did, and Wollersheim is the stellar case. He managed to get $9.2 million out of them. Worked on that case for years, but it took 20 years, and it needs to be a class action. It needs to be hundreds, thousands of former members, just as the Freedom for All in Religion class action in LA in '88, where they had 412 members in the class, which failed because they refused to denigrate the state of clear. I advised them that to make a class, they'd been rejected 4 times. I got them a class as to who they were suing, which was breaking the corporate veil. But I found out that I'd sort of said, look, the only thing, you can't sue them on religious grounds. You've got to sue them on promises of mental health, which are repeatedly made, modern science and mental health, and the state of clear, that they're promising this and they've never delivered it. It's been promised repeatedly. And the lawyers were cock a hoop after 2 years of trying to understand what these people were suing for. It's like, great, we can do that. 6 months later, I found out that they didn't want to denigrate the state of clear because the people suing were still themselves practitioners of Scientology. They were independents. And so
there we go.
Taking on the idea that you'd have perfect recall, photographic recall, and pure intelligence and no emotional problems, would never catch a cold again, all promised in Dianetics, Modern Science, Mental Health, and repeatedly. You wouldn't be able to raise people from the dead, cure leukemia, cancer. All these physical claims of cure, are false.
It's a very valid point.
Needs to be pushed,
Yes, absolutely. And finally, a super chat here from Treasure Bloke, left 2 voicemails with Aftermath last week's for Alex. Thank you. That's not the best way of contacting me. The Aftermath Foundation exists to help people escape and leave Scientology. Their helpline is not a way to contact me. The best way of contacting me is hello@apostatealex.com. So please drop me an email address, and please only call the Aftermath helpline if you need help leaving and escaping Scientology. I don't know.
Or you want to give them make a donation.
Well, if you want to give them a donation, go to the website, theaftermathfoundation.org. Their phone number is for people who need help escaping and leaving. And I don't know why you would think that calling that number is a good way of contacting me. But please, my contact information is in the description of every single video that I've ever put out. hello@apostatealex.com. Thank you so much, John, for joining me. I found this really, really insightful. I'm looking forward to doing it again. Any final parting comments before we wrap up?
No, it's been great. It's let's do this again soon and take more questions. We'll shove it up on our YouTube channel and field whatever comments and questions we get there, and just keep up the good work. I'm retired. I'm just a guy sitting on the sidelines making scholarly comment and writing rude books about Scientology. You're the guy who's actually having to do the work and get harassed for it. I'm hoping they won't stop harassing me again. I didn't like it. And so, more power to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who's been watching this. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up and go and subscribe to John's channel down below. And we'll see you on the next one.
Great.